Okay, everybody, we are going to be doing some jump ring soldering here, and the trick that we have found that we like the best is to put the solder under the seam of the jump ring, so the torch pulls that solder up through the seam. It also doesn't bubble off, the solder sticks around. We're using hard solder here. I recommend that. Alright, in this scenario, we're doing Cindy's jump ring soldering onto sheet. Right here I'm warming up my flux until it's dried, and then I'm going underneath to begin the melting process. Kind of keeping it in that area down there by the jump ring until the solder flows. I have cross locks with Chris Anderson's from Lion Punch Forge. Hold down. So anyway, I decided I would do a secondary solder on this because I wasn't liking those lumps. So once all my heat sinks were removed, besides the mesh, I just went back in. I didn't add any additional solder. I just did it one more time to get things to flatten out a bit. And that's about it. Yeah, I think Cindy's got a big job ahead of her because she wants to do a whole strip like that. Very challenging. So we have another question here, how to attach and make spheres. There's a couple methods for creating them. One is to use half jump rings, a hole punch, thin wire, and clip it. You can also mark on a grid on sheet with dividers and clip that with your shears. If you want flat bottom, melt on a charcoal block, and if you want round, melt on a block that has holes drilled in it. So here we have half jump rings that we're going to be balling up. Applying the heat right directly on the wire. Another method for doing this is that drilling holes into a charcoal block. I found my butane was not hot enough for this, so I had to switch to my acetylene. And here are two pieces, and right now I'm using the butane torch, so you can kind of see it's just taking forever and ever for these things to melt, and they didn't really fully melt. So I pulled out my acetylene, and now within seconds I had round spheres. So now I've got a couple of ideas for fusing. This is the first one, and I've used this method once or twice before. This is a 50-50 clear fire and distilled water mix on the top, and I'm also doing a flux on the bottom. You kind of see it's divided in half there. Now theoretically this should have air dried, but I was too much in a hurry and dried it with my torch, so it wasn't as sticky as it could have been. Now we're applying the flux, and there was quite a bit there. That could also have air dried, but you can use your torch to warm it up, and it'll hold things in place if they don't wiggle around too much. You don't want too much fluid on there. If there is, wick it off with some rolled up paper towel. So now I'm going in and I'm going to heat the entire piece. Unlike with soldering, I want this whole thing, this section, to come up to temp about the same time because it's in the same area. So we have yet another method for attaching spheres to a backplate. In this instance, I'm applying a liberal coating of flux to the front of my backplate. Then I'm going to warm it with my torch until the white part just kind of flattens out a bit before it glasses. And then I'm on standby with my spheres, and I kind of tap them on the charcoal to take off any excess flux on there, and you put them down and they stick right to the flux. The trick is to make sure that you have the back part facing down if it's a flat back. Here's another method. This is a lot easier to arrange your spheres in. You lay them in, you basically put distilled water on your piece and then drop your spheres next to each other in it, and then you can move it around with a paintbrush. This is usually done in granulation with hide glue, but as you just saw, I didn't have any. So I'm going to use 1 drop of the Clearfire or hide glue if you've got it, to 12 drops of distilled water, and then you want to mix them together well. The less hide glue, the better. So here I am applying the spheres after I got it wet, and you can watch as they kind of adhere together. If they're not adhering, add a little more water. So you really don't want to add the hide glue liquid solution until you've got everything all set up and ready to roll. It's also preferable to air dry. Yep, it is. Okay, once again, I'm going to heat the whole thing up. What we're kind of watching for with silver, it's a little more difficult to tell than gold, but things start to get shiny, and that means that everything is starting to get a little liquid. So there we go. Okay, Michelle wanted to know about silver dust and how to apply it. I use the liquid Flux on here. I could have been a lot more precise if I'd used a fine tip brush, but for demo purposes, I really didn't care. But if I was doing this for reals, I would probably use, like I said, a fine brush and be very careful about not getting anything on the spheres at all. So right now I'm getting the silver out and sprinkling it all over. I've also got the paper underneath, so anything that drops through will fall back into the envelope. If you've got any on, you shouldn't have any on the spheres because there's no liquid up there. So now what I'm doing is taking off any silver dust that may have accumulated, and at this point I would also start cleaning up the edges. You can run your finger along there, or a Q-tip, or a toothpick. And I'm just kind of warming up the Clearfire now so it doesn't bubble off for this process. And once again, because it's fusing, I'm moving the torch around more than I normally would. Trying to get that metal really, really hot, which it is getting. I find that there's always extra dust that rubs off. So sometimes you have to do this 2 or 3 times if you want a thicker layer. You can also sprinkle as you heat, but I find it too complex for my brain. You can try it. I'm also worried about getting silver all over my screen, so I'm trying to cut down on that. So I'd rather do this in 2 stages to have a more robust coating on there. So here we are on to fusing fun. This is a great thing to do with scrap. So what I'm doing is I'm dipping some scrap wire from my refining box into Flux, and then kind of just dumping it on the surface of the copper, heating it up so that things stick on there and the flux dries. And then I decided that I'd rather do this by heating it from the back side, at least at this moment. So I kind of heated up the back, I really did heat up the back of the copper pretty hot, and then I had to go into the front side and start melting that silver onto the backplate. The goal here is to try to retain as much of the shapes as possible. You're not going to get a fuse like you would with argentium or silver on silver. So this next little section is me going overboard. Found some more scrap and just kind of sticking it on there and with the solder pick, trying to flatten it as it softens and just melting the heck out of everything. Okay, this heating from behind to protect small items is great for soldering on settings and small jump rings on the surface. If you've got a larger backplate and a smaller element, heating it from behind is one way to really protect that tiny element that's sitting on top. And here we have attaching even thinner wire to a backplate. Pretend maybe that this is a very fine, tiny setting. And I'm not using the tripod here. What I'm doing is I'm keeping that torch tip away from the metal. I'm not really touching it at all. The refracted heat and from the tip is all that's necessary. And you can see how shiny that silver is getting, the little twisted wire thing. So I'm constantly watching the shininess of that. If it gets too shiny or the backplate gets too shiny, I have to get out of there. This one, we've got a more robust piece on top here, so I'm going to put the torch on the backplate, but I'm not going to put the torch on the wire itself. There's enough heat, you can see everything getting shiny there. There's enough heat coming off of that backplate without ever having to touch that wire. So that's it, folks. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to watch the almost 2-hour Q&A soldering intensive class 2.